What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. So we're on to our next video on our unit on motivation, emotion, and stress. Our first one, we talked about some of the classic theories of motivation, why we do the things we do, what pushes us or pulls us and motivates us. Next up, we're going to get into a couple specifics, starting with hunger motivation and how that leads us to do certain things. Then next, we'll get into work and achievement motivation as well. So there are a few different triggers for what causes hunger and what motivates us to eat. We're going to look at it from a biopsychosocial perspective, biological, psychological, and social, and that theory of psychology and how those three work together to motivate us and control our behavior. So first, we have biological or physically, what triggers hunger. Stomach contractions. We've all been in that spot before where you feel that pang in your stomach and you're kind of like, ooh, I'm hungry. I got to find something to eat, right? So that's one thing that can push us there. Our body's chemistry. We'll talk about glucose levels and blood sugar and how insulin and the pancreas play a role in that. And then also we'll get a call back to the hypothalamus and how it is involved in regulating hunger and telling us when we need to eat more or when we need to stop eating as well. So first up, the psychology of hunger are stomach contractions or pangs send signals to the brain that make us aware of our hunger, right? And we've all experienced that, like we said. There were two psychologists, Cannon and Washburn, who studied this, and Washburn swallowed a balloon to measure his stomach contractions. So every time he felt hungry, he would press down on this key, and they would correlate that with their stomach contractions and their hunger pains and see how many times they occurred over the course of 10 minutes, right? And that was one way of measuring stomach contractions and correlating it with hunger. Next up, you have the glucose or blood sugar levels in your body. Your body's normally pretty good at maintaining its blood sugar level, yet the hormone insulin decreases glucose in blood, right? Lowering our blood sugar and making us feel hungry. So this is one way of our bodies. Our body lets us know, like, hey, it's time to eat. You have low blood sugar. You need that level of blood sugar to have energy and for your body to function. Right? This is an issue that diabetics have. Their pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin, so they don't get that feeling, right? So they need, or their blood sugar can get too high and it can be dangerous, or it can drop too low and they won't know that they need to eat something. It can be dangerous as well. But again, this is going back to our endocrine system. Our pancreas releases that hormone of insulin to regulate our hunger. And next up in our biological perspective here of hunger, we have our brain, right? We do not consciously notice these changes that are occurring in our body's chemistry. Instead, the levels of glucose in the blood are monitored by receptors in our stomach, liver, and intestines, because those are all part of the digestive system. And they send signals to the brain, specifically our hypothalamus. And our hypothalamus is going to tell us when we should eat and when we should stop, right? Because it's kind of like the director of our brain and of our systems. So first up, the two parts of the hypothalamus. You have the lateral hypothalamus and the ventromedial hypothalamus, and they control two different things. So your lateral hypothalamus brings on hunger. It tells you when it's time to eat, right? It goes off and says, your body needs nourishment, needs food, you need to up your blood sugar level, let's eat. Okay, and that's one way to remember your lateral hypothalamus. Let's eat, right? It starts with an L, time to eat, let's eat. They've done studies on this. If you destroy it or lesion it in animals, they starve to death, right? Literally, they will stop eating and they'll die, right? Because their brain they don't feel hungry. Their brain's not telling them to eat because their lateral hypothalamus has been damaged or destroyed or lesioned. On the flip side, you have the ventromedial hypothalamus, and this depresses our hunger stimulation. Meaning, once you've eaten, this is the part of your brain that says, okay, well, that's enough. We don't need any more. We've all had that experience where you're like Thanksgiving or Christmas, and you're like, oh, man, I feel like I have like a food baby in me, right? Your ventromedial hypothalamus is telling you, along with your full stomach, that you don't need to eat anymore. Stop, right? Now, they've done studies where they've destroyed this or lesioned it in rats, and those animals will eat excessively until they die, right? And you can see this rat down here, big chunky guy. They lesioned his ventromedial hypothalamus, And he just continued eating and eating and eating until it ate itself to death, which is kind of sad. But ventromedial, a good way to remember this. Ventromedial starts with a V, so does a vomit. If you overeat, you throw up, right? And the ventromedial is supposed to prevent you from that, from throwing up, from eating too much. Okay? So those are two parts of the hypothalamus that control our urges to eat and tell us when to stop. Okay? So moving on to another part of our biology, there's something out there called set point theory. And this is the idea that manipulating the lateral and ventral medial hypothalamus alters the body's weight thermostat, predisposing us to keep our body at a steady weight. So there's this idea that we all kind of have this weight that our body is supposed to be at, and our body will do what it needs to in order to keep us at that weight, right? And if you lose too much weight, your body's going to increase its food intake and decrease energy expenditure to try to keep you at that set point. And if you gain weight, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to decrease your hunger and increase your energy, right? So this is the idea that we all have this weight that we should be at and we should live at. And if you've ever seen or talked to anyone who's tried to lose a lot of weight and they lose a certain amount and then they hit this plateau where they seemingly can't lose any more, or you've talked to someone who's tried to, work out, gain strength, gain weight, and they also hit this plateau and it seems like they can't go above it, that kind of correlates or relates itself to the set point theory that we all have a specific weight that our body wants to maintain and keep us at. In addition, to maintain that set point, the body not only adjusts food intake through the hypothalamus and energy output, it also adjusts its basal metabolic rate. And we've heard of this, maybe you've heard of it as just our body's metabolism. It's the body's resting rate of energy expenditure, right? It's dropping when less activity is occurring. So we all have a basal metabolic rate. We all have a certain metabolism. Some people's are higher than others. Some people's are lower than others. And that helps to control our set point and maintain the weight that our body thinks we need to be at. Now, not all researchers believe in the idea of set point because we've seen that slow, sustained changes in body weight can change your set point. So if we're not talking like fad diets or crash diets where people lose a bunch of weight quickly and then they immediately put it back on, right? We've seen that before, but there are cases where people can lose weight slowly over time and make changes to their body's biology physically, and then they can change their set point through that way, right? People have successfully lost hundreds of pounds and kept it off because they've changed their set point in theory. So moving on to the psychology portion of biopsychosocial, there's a few different types of or ways psychology plays a role in hunger. There's external incentives, right? You eat because you're triggered by the presence of food, especially tasty food that we find attractive, right? So let's say a classmate brings in donuts first block, and you're like, oh, well, I'm not really hungry, but those donuts look delicious, right? So you have one, even though you weren't hungry. Right? We eat by the clock. We eat because it's time to eat lunch or dinner. So those of us who have first or second lunch, there's a big gap in there, right? First lunch is pretty early, second lunch is late, but eventually our body gets used to that time. And then we find ourselves getting hungry around that time after we've been eating at that time consistently. There's also social eating. You eat at an event because you are expected to. So maybe you go out to dinner, or you go to your boyfriend or girlfriend's house for dinner, and their parents make something that you don't really like, but you eat it anyway because you're kind of expected to and you don't want to offend them, right? Or you go to a Super Bowl party, that's coming up, right? What do we do at Super Bowl parties? We socially eat, right? Even if we're not hungry, there's food there, everybody's eating, I'll eat too, right? Some people eat or do not eat because of stress and depression, right? We have stress eating. You can eat more to cope with certain situations. Sometimes depressed people do the same thing, or an opposite. People stop eating because they're too stressed out or depressed and they have things going on that are occupying their minds, and they don't think about their hunger. There's some other eating cues, like the holidays we just went through. Many people put on weight throughout the holidays because there is so much social eating and external incentives. You eat because you're bored, things like that. So those are all psychological impacts of hunger. There's also the cultural part, right? Biopsychosocial, the socio-cultural aspect of eating. This is our taste preference. Is it biology or culture? It's a little bit of both, right? Our body chemistry and our environmental factors together influence not only when we feel hunger, but what we feel hungry for. Okay, so here's a Beijing street market in China, right? Some common foods. You have scorpion, crickets, beetles. We look at this and we're like, man, no way do I want to eat that, right? But different cultures look at it and they think of it as something good, tasty, right? Maybe if I put up Chipotle or pizza or your favorite food on here, you'd be way more into it, right? But culture does play a major role in terms of what we're used to eating on a daily basis. Okay, so moving into eating disorders now, which is a large part, plays a big role for many people around the world in terms of their hunger and their motivation. First, anorexia nervosa, most of us just know it as anorexia, is characterized by a normal weight person. Okay, so someone who's not overweight, usually adolescent women, although we are seeing a rise in it in males as well, losing dramatic amounts of weight continuously and still feeling overweight. So there's the key part, this key psychological aspect here. Like this woman um, and one of the Olsen twins both experienced anorexia. They were losing weight, and yet they still would look in the mirror and see themselves as overweight. There was this disconnect between perception and reality. Right? And so they'll undereat and undereat until they get to that point, which can be very dangerous as your body starts to eat itself and the muscles, and your heart becomes very um, vulnerable to issues because it's losing strength. So, continuing, there's also bulimia nervosa, or most people know it as bulimia. It's a disorder characterized by overeating, usually high caloric foods, and then purging or vomiting, laxative use, fasting, or even excessive exercise. Right, so it's this idea of binging and purging, but purging doesn't have to be throwing up. It can be laxative use, like we said, fasting, or excessive exercise. So these people usually are pretty normal weight, maybe even a little bit overweight because of their overeating. But as a result of that, they try to make up for it by exercising too much, taking diet pills. They have this preoccupation with their body shape, or they feel stressed out, or they feel guilty because of the amount that they ate. So they purge it in some way. One last eating disorder is just binge eating. And this is essentially the same thing as bulimia without the purging aspect, right? There's no type of purging or over excessive exercise or anything like that. You're just eating too much and you continue. It's almost as if your ventromedial hypothalamus is not telling you that you're full, right? There may be an issue there. Okay, so as we wrap up, there's body image. And in Western cultures, we tend to overemphasize thin body image more than other cultures around the world, if you compare. And cultures who put more emphasis on appearance have higher rates of eating disorders, right? In the United States, we've noticed a struggle there. And usually, generally, and throughout history, it's affected women more. But again, we've seen a rise in young men as well, especially with the rise of media and social media, and the advent of airbrushing and changing images and things like that that show people in a way that isn't real, right? And it gets to young people, particularly teenagers who follow these people. And we've seen rates go up as this media has increased, because it's hard to tell reality from what the perception or the fake images are. And it has a large impact on body image and the way that people view themselves, because we're seeing these unreachable or unrealistic examples of what we think our body should look like, or what we think people would prefer us to look like. So to wrap it up, summary of hunger: we have the biological, psychological, and the social factors all involved with our hypothalamus, our stomach pangs, our glucose, blood sugar levels, things like that. Then we have our mood, sights and smell of a variety of tastes of foods, thinking about other people, being around them eating, things like that. And we have the social aspect, the cultural aspect, our learned taste preferences, and the learned restraint in cultures idealizing thinness, right? Body image. So all of these things come together, biopsychosocial, to motivate our eating behavior. So I hope you enjoyed this, learned a little something. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in class.